Hello and good evening. My name is Alan Benstock and I welcome you to tonight's Milim Talk. Your usual host, Jonathan Straight, is still travelling, returning from holiday, so he's asked me to step in his place. For you, those of you that know, I'm normally the person behind the scenes, and when I'm on the screen, there's something wrong, but hopefully not tonight. And also, if I am doing this myself, I doesn't quite always move as quickly and as smoothly as possible. But if you just bear with me, if there's any problems, I much appreciate that. So before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just remind everybody that tonight's talk is being recorded and will be available on catch up, hopefully by this time tomorrow. During the evening, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat and or the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. We have guests watching from around the world, and these particular times I did check, and there's our people hopefully will be watching from Israel, and our thoughts are all with you at this difficult time. And so tonight's guest speaker, Mike Levy, who is well known to us. No, this is where I knew we'd have problems with this. Got to get it the right way around. That's it. Who's well known to Milim. He's spoken before, but more importantly, he is one of the playwrights of our Lee's contribution to Lee's 2023 Meet Me at Cantors. So it's I'm just checking the date. Not even 2 months since you were with us in September. I appreciate a lot has happened since then, but and those of you who were able to join us for the live performances, we hope everybody we recognize your contributions. It was really good play. We had lots of good feedback. There will be recordings available shortly. They are still being processed, but because of the events of recent weeks, those people who are involved in doing the editing have been distracted on other things. But anyway, we'll look forward to that. But tonight we have a completely different topic. Saying that, it's all to do with playwrights and authors, but Mike's going to be talking about what you describe as the first Jewish director. That's right, isn't it? Well, playwright, the first Hebrew play. Yes, good.
Hebrew plays.
So I'm going to hand over to Mike, and I will be back later.
Okay, thanks very much, Alan, for that. Yes, it's quite right. It's always a pleasure and a great privilege actually to talk to Milim and Milim supporters around the world. And as you say, it's a very difficult time at the moment, and we're all going through some terrible thoughts and traumas and personal tragedies and so on. Hopefully, tonight's talk will take us back a few centuries before all this, and maybe provide a little bit of, I would say, light relief, but certainly maybe some diversions from our current worries. I'm going to take you back tonight, in fact, some 500 years, or is it 600 years? My maths isn't very good, to 16th century Italy, and to what most scholars, in fact all scholars, believe to be the first extant play ever written in the Hebrew language. And it was written by a character I'm going to tell you a lot about tonight. Hopefully, if the technology works, keeps fingers crossed, we will be able to watch a very short excerpt from the play, so you'll get a flavour of what the play is about and what it was like. But now, this is always a nerve-wracking bit, because I'm going to try and share my screen and show you my slideshow, if I can find it. There it is. So let's have a look at that, and let me go on to here. Can you all see that? Does that come up?
Yes, we can see that.
There we are. Yeah, that's come up. So the topic of my talk tonight is...
Just before we do that, it's the same problem we had in the test. You haven't started the slideshow.
Okay, I have, but let's have
it again. Do you just want to come out and start again?
Come out and start again. Okay, hello again, everybody. This is
no, not that far back. Give it a go.
Bring back overhead slide projectors, OHPs. I mean, they never went wrong, did they? Okay, let's have a little look at this. Let's hope this goes right this time. Share the screen and start the...
Yeah, that looks right. There you go. That's it. That's the start.
That's come out?
Yeah, okay. Perfect.
So the topic of my talk today is a playwright of whom about 5 years ago I'd never heard. His name is, or was, Leone ben Isaac Somme, also called Leone de Somme, who was born in 1527 or 1525. No, nobody's really quite sure. But we are sure that he was born in the city-state of Mantua, and we're pretty sure that he died in 1592 in the same city. And there's his name in Hebrew at the bottom. I won't try and pronounce it just in case my pronunciation is not good enough, but there you can see the name of Yehuda ben Yitzchak Somi. So who was he? What play did he write? Why have we never heard of him, or why have very few people heard of him? And for that matter, a question that's on my mind, and maybe should be on yours by the end of my talk, why haven't his plays been performed? Or very rarely anyway. So let's move on. This is always the nerve-wracking bit. Will my second slide come up? If not, I have a bit of interpretive dance to fill in just in case. Oh, I don't have to do the interpretive dance. Well done. So here are some of the books either written about Leone de Somme or books by Leone de Somme in English. There's a book came out very recently, which is an amazing overview of the whole of this remarkable period of Jewish history, the theatre making by Jews in the city of Mantua between about 1520 and about 1650. And the book is called, on the left-hand side, Jewish Theatre Making in Mantua. It's not that all Italian cities, all European cities had Jewish theatre making going on. This was very, very unusual. And I won't say unique, perhaps never, I was always taught at school never to say almost unique, but it was extremely unusual and may have been a unique feature. A book came out recently on Leone de Somme and the performing arts. And I was given a book, a biography called Leone de Somme Ebreo e il Teatro della Moderna. Now, my Italian is as good as my French and German, i.e. 0, so I've not been able to really find out much from the book. However, I do have other books I've got in English, and one is the play A Comedy of Betrothal, which is translated, and I'll tell you more about that later. Another play by de Somme is called The Three Sisters, and that's also been translated. I've got both editions. And on the right-hand side, a book which has recently been translated called I Quattro Dialoghi, which means 4 dialogues on the art of presenting a play, also by Leone. So he was an incredibly prolific writer, and as we'll see, theatre maker, theatre director, pioneer really in the sense of modern theatre, if not one of the pioneers of modern theatre. Well before Shakespeare, by the way. Why haven't we heard of him? Could it be something to do with his background? Well, let's go on. We have some surviving works of Leone's. The one I'm going to talk about tonight, the Comedy of Betrothal, the Tzachut Bedchuta de Kiddushin, roughly translated as the Comedy of Betrothal. You notice its title is in Old Hebrew, and this is significant because the play was written in the Hebrew language, only in the Hebrew language, and has only recently, in the last 40 or 50 years, been translated into English. There's that quattro dialoghi, materia di rappresentazione scenisce. Whoops, someone's looking at me saying, don't even try and pronounce that. 4 dialogues on scenic representation. Very important work, which I'll talk about a bit later, and who's played The Three Sisters, Tre Sorelle. Well, where is Mantua? I hear no one asking. It's, of course, right up in the north of Italy. It's in the Po Valley in what is, I think, was then and still is the province of Lombardy, just below Verona. And in fact, Mantua Shakespeare scholars amongst you Shakespeare fans will know that Romeo and Juliet in Act 5 is set in Mantua. Scene 1, Act 5 says Mantua, a street, enter Romeo, because if you remember, Romeo is banished to Mantua. And not surprising when you look at the wider map, Mantua is to the southwest of Verona, where that play was set. But this play we're talking about tonight is not set there, it's set in Mantua. So this kind of gives you a brief overview of where we're talking. West of Venice, southwest of Verona, east of Milan, although that's not quite on the map. Now there is the earliest known extant map, city map, it's actually a very good one, of Mantua from 1628, a little bit after our period, maybe 100 years after Leone was born, but still pretty much as it would have been in his day. And And I put a great big arrow next to what looks like a tall tower. Can you see that? There's a tall tower marked on the map. It's right in the center of the town, and that tall tower is still there today. And it's a significant building in the story of our play. So keep that image in your mental photo album. There is such a thing. But there is Mantua. You can see not a particularly huge city. It was surrounded on all four sides by water, lakes, and rivers, so it was well defensible. And it was a city in which, like many of the Italian cities at the time, was an independent dukedom. There was no such thing, as you remember, as Italy. They were all independent dukedoms. Okay, we'll come back to the Duke of Mantua in a moment. He plays a very important part in our story. But what do we know of Leone's life? Now, sadly, because he lived 500 years ago, and like Shakespeare, no one bothered to write his biography, we've only got a patchy idea of his life and what and where he did it. But we do know that he was born around 1525, maybe 27, in Mantua, and he was a member of a very distinguished Jewish family, the Portaleones, who had been doctors and scientists and so on to the rich aristocracy of the Italian city-states. So a very well-known, very well-established family, been there for hundreds of years before our Leone comes into play. The Jews escaping from increasingly restrictive papal bulls against Jews and new ghettos founded in Rome and Florence and Bologna flocked to Mantua, where under the Gonzago family, who were the dukes, the Jews were protected to an extent. So unlike most of the other cities of Italy, who were under the cosh at this point of the Pope, the Dukes of Mantua, the Gonzagos, ploughed a relatively independent furrow. And that meant that Jews knew that if they got to Mantua, they were relatively safe from ghettoization or from all sorts of violence and anti-Semitism. There was then a deal between the Mantuan Jews, of which there were about 2,000 in Leone's time, which was a big population at that time, 2,000 Jews, and the various dukes of Mantua, the dukes, the Gonzago dukes. And that deal was a very unusual deal, that if you don't know the history of this part of Italy, it would probably, which I certainly didn't, by the way, it would take you a long time to guess. And the deal was this, that in return for the Jews' protection by the dukes, and in return for being hammered by taxation, which they were in other Italian city-states, they were still taxed, but not quite as badly as in other places. In return, the Jews had to give something in return to the dukes and their family. What did they give in return? Not gold, not silver, no. They gave, wait for it, are you sitting down? Theatrical productions. This was the deal. So in return for a quiet life, they had to produce a theatrical production, at least one, maybe two, every year to the Dukes of Mantua. Leone then became one of the most, perhaps the foremost writer of these theatrical productions. He wrote poems, carnival plays, pastoral dramas, sketches, the earliest treatise on stage direction, on the art of stage direction anywhere in Europe, and the earliest known play in Hebrew, the Comedy of Betrothal. He also directed plays, not just his own, and was a noted choreographer. And he probably, although we don't know for certain, he probably ran a Jewish troupe of actors in Mantua. We do know that the Jewish troupe of actors, whether it was led by him or others, were the ones that performed these new plays, these new sketches for the Mantuan dukes as part of this deal that they had with the Gonzago family. As a boy, we know that Leone studied Torah and Talmud with a well-known rabbi of northern Italy, Rabbi Provenzal. And we also know that he was a very precocious writer. At the age of 11, he translates poems by Ibn Ben Ezra into Italian for the first time. So this is obviously a very bright boy and a fantastic linguist. He's employed, we know, as a young man as a scrivener of a religious text, a copier of religious Hebrew texts, but in his spare time starts to write poems in Hebrew and Italian. And one of the poems he writes, which still exists, is called In Defense of Women. What's unusual about it, and certainly unique at the time, is that the poem is in alternate couplets, one couplet in Hebrew, one couplet in Italian. The Hebrew and the Italian all apparently rhyme beautifully in the right meter, and it's a very clever piece of work by what was a very young man, probably late teens writer. In 1550, we think, round about 1550, he writes the Comedy of Betrothal, probably written for the Jewish celebrations of Purim for that year. So what's likely to have happened is that his Jewish troupe that was performing for the Gonzaga Dukes took a bit of time off to perform a play for the Jewish audience in Mantua, in the Hebrew language, in biblical Hebrew, kind of a mixture of biblical Hebrew, and we think possibly a bit of Aramaic thrown in as well. Which of course begs that question, who understood these plays? And the answer must be that there must have been audiences amongst this Jewish community who were fluent enough in Hebrew, I'm sure they were, to have followed every nuance of what was actually quite a complex play, a very wordy, verbose play, which we'll come to in a moment. His writing brought him to the attention of the Mantuan court and an invitation to join the Mantuan Arts Academy in 1566. Now, that sounds like not that special, does it? But in fact, he was the only Jew ever to be invited to join this very prestigious local Academy of Arts. However, he was not allowed to join as a full member. This is like Jewish golf club world, isn't it? He could join as a scrittore, as a writer, but not as a full member. But still, it was most unusual, if not unique, that a Jew was invited to what essentially was a Christian arts organization. And for this academy, he wrote many, many plays, intermezzi, little scenes between plays and operas and dances, and much poetry. In 1567, we know that he asked permission of the Dukes to build a purpose-built theatre for Mantua. Had he have done this, ladies and gentlemen, this would have been the first purpose-built theatre in Italy, and indeed one of the very first in Europe. The first purpose-built theatres in London were not around until the 1570s. However, the Dukes denied him permission, and we know that from a legal document. We don't know why he was denied, but sadly, it didn't come to pass. By 1580, we are told in the records that he was able to appear in the streets without the yellow badge. Now, Mantua, being relatively liberal at this time, still demanded, because the Pope demanded it, that all Jews wore a yellow badge to distinguish themselves from their Christian neighbors. It was only to the very most prestigious Jews that were given permission not to wear that badge, and one was Leone de Somme, and there was another one I'll talk about in just a moment. In 1585, he'd made so much money from his writing, lucky man, that he built a new synagogue in Mantua with the Duke's permission. So obviously he's keeping very much in touch with his community. He's not one of these Jewish artists that kind of turns his back on his community, very, very far from it. What he does with his wealth is he sinks it into building a new synagogue in the city. And in 1587, he writes a carnival play, probably his last one, for a new Duke, Duke Vincenzo I Gonzago, and the play is called Three Sisters, and it's in Italian. It's an Italian comedy. The new Duke who replaced the old one, I'm going to talk about in a moment, because that changeover was quite significant. Leone dies in Mantua in about 1592. We're not exactly sure, but that seems about right. And we know from a more or less contemporary account that his tombstone read, "Leone needs no mourning, as all his life he sought the welfare of his people, and in his old age raised a synagogue, and these have become his memorial," which I think is very touching. We don't have that tombstone. We don't even know where he was buried. The 16th century graveyard or cemetery is no longer there, and no one knows where it was. However, we do have this contemporary account of what it said on the tombstone, which is amazing that we've got that. Now, there is a coda to the story of Leone de Somme, and that takes place in the other major Italian city of Turin. I'm going to take you briefly to Turin Library in 1904. Turin Library was the was the resting place, if you like, of the vast majority of Leone de Somme's output. I believe there were 16 volumes of his plays, sketches, poems, treatises, Hebrew works, philosophical works, and so on. We're told because the catalogues exist about what the library held. And his works were hardly stored anywhere else in the world. Now, here's the bad news, everyone. Are you sitting down? In 1904, Turin Library burnt to the ground, including all 16 volumes of Leone de Somme's entire output, almost entire output. So nearly all of his work has been lost. There are no copies of it. We don't know what they contained. And tragically, it's gone, except for 3 or 4 major works that I started by showing you, which by sheer fluke had been copied at the time or printed at the time and placed in other libraries, thank goodness, that didn't burn to the ground. So we do have a Comedy of Betrothal, we do have the Three Sisters, we do have the Quattro Dialogi, and we have 1 or 2 other little scraps of works here and there. So the if you like, the death of Leone takes place, as it were, artistically in 1904. There's the first of the dukes that he worked for, Duke Guglielmo Gonzago, the sponsor of the arts, and to some extent, and a great extent, in fact, a friend of the Jews. He's the one who allowed Leone to join the Academy of Arts. He was the one who commissioned him to write the annual Carnival play for his family. And he was the one who fought off many attempts by popes and their officials to apply more rigid and strict restrictions on the Jews. So generally a good man, generally a good thing. Now, before I go on to talk about the play, I just want to take you on a little holiday, some little holiday snaps that I took last year on a visit to Mantua, because I got so obsessed with Leone and the play that I wanted to go and see the place in 2022, where the play was certainly written and very likely performed. Here, by the way, is the Ducal Palace, the one that this guy lived in, and you can't really get a scale of the place. It is a gigantic set of palatial rooms that still exist today as it did in the 16th century. By the way, in the foreground there is Sheila, my dear wife, smiling. She's in the background here as well, smiling at the camera. I just thought I'd throw that in. If you go inside the Ducal Palace, it is filled with the most fantastic frescoes by the 15th century artist Mantegna, and you can see some examples of it here. So it's a kind of fabulously decorated, rich palace that the Dukes of Mantua lived in. And it was here, and probably in these courtyards, maybe even this one, that the carnival plays written by Leone would have been performed outdoors. I'm just guessing that, but I'd like to think, in my old romantic way, that the plays would have been performed in this courtyard. It was certainly the major courtyard of the Ducal Palace, so you can only see part of it in my photograph. And here is the Palazzo della Ragione. Again, do you remember I pointed out that tower? You can just about see it again. That's in the 17th century drawing of Mantua. That is the same tower that you can see today. And what's important to me is that the building on the left of the tower, not the one on the right, which is a later addition church, the one on the left is the palazzo itself, and that was the Court of Justice. There's the inside of it. And I'm showing you this because it comes up in our play. It's where all the trials and court proceedings were held, probably with the Duke, maybe not all the time, but certainly the Duke presiding over some of the more important trials. The reason I'm showing you this is because we are told in the play that I'm going to tell you about that the Duke and the Palace of Justice are mentioned by name, or courts of justice are mentioned by name as locations in the play. So it's happening somewhere in this area. And there's a 15th century merchant's house, which is one of the very few surviving buildings of Leone's period. And guess what? Act 1, Scene 1 of the play I'm going to tell you about says we are in the merchants. We're outside the house of a rich Jewish merchant called Ammon, and it could have looked something like this. In my fantasy imagination. Just finishing off my quick tour of Mantua today, which is a most beautiful city, by the way, and I do recommend anyone to go there. It's kind of a little bit off the beaten track tourist-wise, but it's only an hour away from Verona Airport, so you can get there very easily. This is the one surviving synagogue, one surviving shul in Mantua, and we were being shown around by one of the very few members now of the surviving Jewish families there. It looks a bit like Bevis Marks, but it's nowhere near as old. It's actually a 19th century copy of a much earlier synagogue that was pulled down sometime in the 19th century, or maybe a bit earlier. There is a small Jewish community still in Mantua, and there is the leader of it, the guy with the grey hair. He's called Emanuele Coloni, and there's his wife looking at him sideways on, Loredana Coloni. And they gave Sheila and our friends and myself a guided tour of what was the former ghetto in Mantua, almost said Manchester, former ghetto in Mantua. Very little of it remains, but some streets are still as they were in Leone's day. And as you can see, one house has actually got a mezuzah on the wall there, because it's kind of a museum, if you like. It's sort of a place of Jewish interest, although I don't think any Jews live there. So Mantua still has a little bit of a Jewish past, and certainly Emanuele and Loredana were very, very keen to tell me about Leone, who is something of a local hero, being the playwright of the town. Now, although Mantua did not have a purpose-built theatre in 1570s or 60s when Leone wanted to build it, a few decades later, one was built in the nearby town of Sabonieta, which was also had a very large Jewish community. So a theatre in those days would have looked something like this. This is the surviving theatre from the 17th century in Sabonieta. And so one could imagine that the plays that he wrote, had he built a theatre, would have looked something like this. And then just finally on my little tour of Mantua, we came across a plaque dedicated to two rabbis, famous rabbis, who from Mantua are buried in a surviving cemetery, not the one that Leone was involved in or is buried in, sadly, because we don't know where that was. But there is a Jewish presence in the town. That's why I showed you that plaque there. And there's Vincenzo I, the Gonzago ruler of Mantua, who took over from 1587 in the latter years of Leone's life. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because although he was indeed a patron of the arts, so much so that he took into his court the Jewish composer Salomone Rossi, who some of you may have heard of, and certainly in our Jewish choir in Cambridge, Kolechad, we sing some of his beautiful works. Salomone Rossi was also from Mantua, and was his patron was the Gonzago Dukes, and he was also one of the very few Jews allowed not to wear the yellow badge, so he was the other one. He was much younger, by the way, than Leone, but no one else has said this, but I'm pretty certain, in fact I am certain, that they would have known each other. They were contemporaries, certainly for about 10 years, were both being supported by the Dukes and so on. So it's interesting that Rossi, whose name is much better known than Leone's, is part of this world. I'm just going to finish off my little tour of Mantua by showing you there a blown up picture of the 17th century map of a particular street in Mantua. This was really in the heart of the Jewish area of Mantua. And I don't know if you can see on the top of the picture and the bottom as well, but look at the top of the picture and it looks like, it's like a gateway. There's a gateway with an arch. If you look very carefully, that sadly is a gateway of the newly erected ghetto that was placed in the town after the death of Leone. He didn't live, thank goodness, to see all these good works by the liberal Gonzago being replaced by a tightened ghetto, the closing down of Jewish theatre troupes, the ending really of the liberal regime that had existed. And the man behind this tightening up, this ghettoization of the Jews was Vincenzo I, the successor to the good guy, Duke of Mantua. So, and the reason why, not because he particularly hated Jews, but he was much weaker when it came to trying to stand up against the papal authorities, who said, look, these Jews have had it too good for too long. It's now, you've got no choice but to follow the commandments, as it were, of creating a ghetto for the Jews, locking them in at night, taxing them to the high heavens, and certainly not having them perform your carnival plays in our festivals. So all that had finished just a few years after Leone's death. So let's look at the play that I've been involved in. It's called A Comedy of Betrothal. It's a full-length play. It did survive the fire at Turin Library because it had been copied and was held somewhere else. And we have a drama group in our shul in Cambridge, and one of our members said, have you heard about this play? And I hadn't. Is it something maybe we should at least read and maybe consider performing? Because as far as we know, it's never been performed in Britain before, very rarely performed anywhere since the 17th or 17th century, probably. I think there was a reading, there might have been a performance in Israel about 20 or 30 years ago. So we had a look at it. It was a bit too long for our drama group, so I basically took a hatchet job to it and edited it down, simplified some of the language, and created what I call a performable version for our drama group. So I can't take any more credit than that. It was kind of editing, simplifying, and producing a version of the play that we felt we could perform. We haven't done it fully yet, by the way, but maybe one day we will. The play has a very large group of characters. It's set in a mythical biblical Sidon in Canaan. And it includes characters such as Ammon, a rich Jewish merchant, Deborah, his wife, and the lovers, Bruria, the daughter of Ammon and Deborah, and Yedidia, a suitor, a student of Rabbi Amitai. All these characters are Jewish in the play. Pashur, a cheeky Jewish servant, Yakaria, Jewish maidservant, a crooked lawyer. There has to be a crooked lawyer in this kind of commedia dell'arte world. He's known in Hebrew as Hamdan or Master Greedy, Ephron, the rich Jewish neighbor, and so on and so on and so on. What's really unique about this play is that the hero of the play is a character called Rabbi Amitai. Amitai, of course, meaning a bringer of truth. He's a man of learning and wisdom, and he provides the twist at the end of the play, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Or maybe I won't. Maybe you should wait and see the play. Now, the play is full of biblical allusions, full of it, and not least the names of the characters, the Hebrew names, are linked to their characters, like Yedidia, divinely favored, Bruria, God's purity, she's pure, and so on. And then there's a nice play, Yakaria, the maidservant, who's either dreary or precious, which is both in the play, and so on and so on. And Chauvel, a rich slave, who's wearing nobleman's clothes, so he's kind of almost pretending to be a rich person. The Rabbi Amitai, the truth bringer, and interesting character Ammon, the betrothal breaker, the man who breaks a promised betrothal, whose name can either mean gullible or someone who easily believes anything. But also the scholars believe that his name might have been linked to Haman, given this was a Purim play, remember, and you wanted someone to boo at. So Ammon is a sort of baddie in the play, and his wife, Deborah, kind of a very loud-mouthed woman, and Deborah means the bee. So all the names, like in Commedia dell'arte, give some clue to the characters that they are playing. Here's a drawing in the performing version, the printed performing version, translated by a scholar called Alfred Golding, and just reminds us that we're talking here about Renaissance Italy. This is how Bruria and Yedidia might have looked on stage if it was performed in Leone's time. Rather handsome costumes. So let's have a little look at the play itself. Can you just check on the time?
It's 25 to.
Thank you. Just got a time check there. Let's have a little look at the play itself, the comedy of betrothal. It begins with a prologue spoken by a character called Wisdom, who is actually, of course, our playwright, Leone. And it's really interesting, I think, because it's saying something really quite unusual for the Jewish world. I've got it here. I don't know whether you'll be able to read it, but I'm going to read part of it for you. This is the prologue, Wisdom, before the play begins. And it says, I realize that the wise of many lands, whether Greece, Cyprus, or Turkey, have taken pride in the way that they employed language to delight mankind. Their works have been performed before men of distinction and high degree, and their words, and their words, pleasure and utility, are perfectly conjoined. Their eloquence has been used to crush contemptible men and to elevate those who are worthy to bring them honor. Now, some playwrights among the Gentiles have looked down upon the Jews because they seem to lack this literary facility. It is for this reason that I have this day resolved to show that the Hebrew language is not inferior in its artistic power. Indeed, what is a crowning glory for other languages is but a glitter of a shoe buckle for the Hebrew. Hence, men should not deem it a defect in that language because they have not seen it cast, and now into a pleasing comedy. So basically what he's saying here is that Hebrew is a language not just for the holy books, not just for serious study, which it certainly is, but it's also should be part of an international literature as the Greeks have it, for instance, or Latin works. And because it's not been done before, doesn't mean to say that someone shouldn't start it. And here he is starting it, a play for the first time in Hebrew. And he says at the bottom, the very proof of this statement I shall soon place before your eyes, for if the play form is novel for Hebrew, so he's saying that it's never been done before, its capacity for creating parables and proverbs is well known, and so can make it even more marvelous as a medium for theatrical entertainment. May I remind you, by the way, this is 400 years before Ben Yehuda. Here is Leone de Somme arguing for the use of Hebrew as a living language, and here an artistic language in theatrical form, which I suspect that many of the rabbis would not agree with, probably, at that time, maybe even not now. I'm not getting into that one. So let's go on to my next slide, which I can. Here we go. Now, Act 1, Scene 1 is it's set in, well, the play tells us it's set in ancient Sidon or Sidon. Now, to be honest, there is no way is it set in ancient Sidon because the references are to dukes, to courts of justice, to rich merchants' houses. Everything about it actually cries out Mantua. But you know, for reasons to be safe, he sets the play in ancient Sidon. And we're in the house of the merchant Ammon and his wife Deborah, and they're discussing the marriage, the betrothal of their daughter Bruria to the young man Yedidia, who is a man of means, or is he? So I'm now going to go on to the next slide because this is where we need to keep our fingers crossed and pray that this is going to work, because two of our drama group, Paul and Eva, I'll tell you more about them in a moment, have agreed just to, yesterday in fact, to record for me the opening scene from Comedy Betrothal by Leone in translation, obviously not in original Hebrew. So let's hope you can hear this. By the way, Alan, if it can't be heard, I do have an alternative method, so let me know. But let's have a go. Does that come up?
Tell the citizens of Sidon that our daughter Bruria and the handsome Eudidia are to be married. And let us hope that Eudidia's father, the bridegroom's father, will return safely from his trip to Damascus, so that the marriage can be consummated during Purim.
Yes, Ammon, a wedding. And for months, all I've been thinking about is how to make sure our daughter has everything she needs for the wedding. I want her to have the most complete trousseau of any Jewish bride.
Deborah, such extravagance, only to serve your vanity.
My dear husband Ammon, we have no one else but dear Bruria to whom we can leave our worldly goods. And we should endow our future son-in-law with some additional property to make his life easier.
More extravagance.
Only because Eudidia's such a good boy. Intelligent, handsome. There's no one like him anywhere. What a future son-in-law.
Yes, I favoured him over all other suitors, such as his virtue.
And I have increased the presents we'll give to dear Eudidia, only because his father Sholem is a miser, not giving him a stitch of new clothing. We shall give him the finest suits of clothes.
Ah,
Are you listening to me? What's the matter? Something wrong?
Deborah, dearest wife, I have some very bad news.
Stop torturing me. What's in that letter? Is it about Sholem, our future in-law?
Yes, he has died. On his business trip to Damascus, he's dropped dead.
Oh, sorry to hear such awful news. But with his father gone, Eudidia is now going to inherit a vast fortune. Wonderful boy.
But listen to this. Okay, he's left his son with nothing. Sholem has left his son with nothing, given all his wealth to his slave, the slave Chevel.
What? Good job Eudidia hasn't arrived here yet. We must find a new suitor for Bruria. Our dear only child, a suitor she richly deserves.
But I am obliged to give Bruria's hand to Eudidia this week. They are betrothed. I have given my word.
No, dear husband. Sholem has made a mockery of the agreement you two made by leaving his son with nothing. Leaving it all to a slave.
Okay?
Yeah.
I make a promise. I keep it.
The promise does not hold now that he has no money. Bruria would think we had given her to someone poor and helpless. Before I would give her to such a man, I would rather drown her in the sea.
Why are you leaving?
Because I don't want to waste any more words on this matter. I won't say anything to her until we find our daughter a new bridegroom.
But why have you versed your opinion of Eudidia?
It's true that I loved him until Sholem decided to leave him penniless. Now I hate him.
But what crime did the boy commit? He's the same boy as yesterday, still bright and handsome. I'm sure in time he'll regain his fortune.
The character that Eudidia had yesterday is not the same as he has today.
How?
He's a lot poorer than last night.
Oh,
Money brings everything to life. And anyway, how can I bring my daughter to a life of poverty to become a laughingstock? That I shall never allow. I'm going inside now. And believe me, what I want, I get.
oh.
So as you can see, poor old Eudidia is 1 minute is rich, next minute is poor, and suddenly he's become very unsuitable as a betrothed person for the daughter. But giving a little bit more about the play, Eudidia is very angry that the promised betrothal was broken, and it's before the 9 o'clock watershed, isn't it? But I'll say it anyway. He decides to have sex with Bruria, which means that in Jewish law they are married. But then he's accused of rape and convicted and imprisoned. Enter Rabbi Amitai, who is brought in to solve the issue with his wisdom and add in some subplots, including the undoing of a crooked lawyer called Master Greedy. It's actually quite a complex play, and I've just given you a very brief overview of it. But as you can see, the idea that what Leone was trying to show, and I'm sure it doesn't apply today, of course, is that parents who just want to marry their daughter off to the richest suitor really are not behaving in a very honest and Jewish way. And it's a play that's full of Jewish wisdom. It's a play that's full of, what would you say, morals. It's a very high moral play, but given a very farcical commedia dell'arte background. There you can see the final photograph I'm going to show you today is Loredana Coloni, the head of the Mantuan Jewish community, only a few dozen of them left now. And there we are in a restaurant in Mantua reading the Comedy of Betrothal in Mantua. So I hope that's given you a taste for the play. It's a very lively commedia play. It's full of fun. It's full of wisdom. It's full of knockabout comedy. There's even a fight scene in there as well. It's quite risque, oddly enough, as you got from the method that Yedidia used to try and put one over on Ammon and make sure that the betrothal was carried out, and so on. And there's lots and lots of twists and turns in the play. So there we are. That's hopefully made you want to read a bit more about Leone de Somme, possibly even buy a copy of the play, not mine, but by the translated version. Here it is, if you can see it. You have to order it on Amazon. And hopefully one day, one of my great hopes is that a Jewish theatre company will take it up and we can see the entire play performed, the very, very first play ever written in the Hebrew language, and written in the Hebrew language for a very noble reason. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, for a very interesting talk. I'm now, as ever, as we always say, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I will forward them on. So we do have one question which kind of couples with the thought I was having. That's from Janet Stowe. Did the troupe move? She said, did the troupe act also in Vicenza, which is a very old wooden theatre, or was it just within the town, or did it move around the area as well?
Well, the problem is here, as you can imagine, there's a great paucity of records and documents of the time. We simply don't know. We don't know, for instance, we're not sure that the Comedy of Betrothal was ever performed. There's no record of it being performed, although all the kind of circumstantial evidence is that it was. So I didn't know about the theatre in Vicenza, but if it is old, do you know, perhaps you can tell me how old it is?
If Janet wants to type that, we'll find back. Harriet Brostoff has asked, did the actors wear masks, do you think, of that era, or was it, which of course was, as I remember from visiting the Roman theatres in France, there was a lot of mask wearing then, wasn't there?
I suspect, again, we don't know is a short answer, but I suspect yes, because it was very much a commedia dell'arte method, wasn't it, of wearing masks to create character and so on. So I would suspect yes, because this was the very early days of commedia. I think the very first plays as such were from the early 1500s, 1520 maybe. So commedia, which really became a big thing in the 17th and 18th century, was just kind of getting going. But I would have thought, again, we just don't know unless scholars know better than I do. I'm not a scholar of this period, I should say. I would have thought yes, it's a short answer to that.
Janet Stowe says the theatre in Vicenza was 1585.
Oh, very early then, very early. I would probably think that this was written, the Leone's play was written very specifically for the Purim 1550, around about 1550 Purim festivities. As far as we know, it wasn't published, in print form until the early 1600s. That's why we have a copy of it, by the way. There's one or two printed copies from about 1620. So there's nothing from before that period, though there are some notes on some of the copies saying this was, I think one of them says this was written by Leone, and one says this was produced many years ago. So kind of from that we can ascertain that it had been around. So it may well have been. I don't know how long the Vicenza theatre was going, but certainly it was being produced by somebody in the 1620s, when these printed versions were extant. So again, I'm sorry to say, there's a paucity of records from that period.
However, as Peter Madonna, Irish surname, sorry, I do apologise, Peter. Regarding the mask question, the woodcut image you showed shows two masked-faced characters.
That's true, but that drawing was done in the 1980s. So, but it may well be that the person knew that that was the case. So yeah, I mean, very likely, it's very likely, as I said, that they were masked to show their characters. Yeah.
I have a question, but I know David Porter's got his hand up. David, if you do have a question, can you type it in the chat? Because we're in a webinar setting, not a meeting setting. If you can type it, that'd be great. So my question was, going back to the tombstone, I know you made reference to that he built a synagogue, but he also referred to being contributing to the welfare of his people. But what was any evidence of what other work he did in the town? Is there other evidence?
Well, let me go back to the synagogue first of all, which I know more about that than the second half of your question. We don't know where that synagogue was, and there are no records. I asked Emanuele, who was the archivist for the Jewish community in Mantua, who said the existing records don't begin until about 50 years after Leone's death, and there didn't seem to be any record of where that synagogue was. So we don't know where it was, but it certainly was. There certainly was one. In terms of yes, I mean, there was certainly contributions made by Leoneans. Again, there are some documentary records about contributions to welfare organisations in the city, and people. There are kind of records of donations given by him. I need to know more because that's because my focus is on the play rather than the history of.
Fair dues, yes. So there was this kind of, Barbara Conway has a question, but it kind of leads. I'm going to ask a question which occurred to me. Bear in mind, of course, the principles of the Lord Chamberlain in Shakespeare's time. Do you think the plays were performed by just men or men and women?
Well, I asked a scholar of this period that very question, and in fact, the author of the book about Jewish theatre making in Mantua, which, by the way, is a brilliant book. My library has it, and it's a fantastic work. Although it's about £100 to buy. Well, she said that it's all, again, we're not sure, but it almost unimaginable that women would have played women's parts at that period. So yes, men would definitely have played the women's part. There is a really suggestive scene between the two, the maidservant and the Pashur, the male servant, and Yakara, the female servant. And we were quite embarrassed by a contemporary Jewish group, people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. We were quite embarrassed by the language, to be honest. Do you want me to just give you a flavour of it?
I don't see any objection coming on board at this moment in time.
Okay, this is Act 1, Scene 4. Excuse the lack of. So Pashur is trying to get in the house so he can have his way with the maidservant Yakara. Pashur's the male's the servant. Sorry, don't shake my glasses, Sheila says. I'll try not to do that. So Pashur says, "My sweet Yakara, am I forever to stand outside in your street?" Then she says suggestively, "No, the door is wide open, can't you see?" Pashur, "I shall now enter your Garden of Eden." Yakara, "That garden is locked and its fountainhead sealed." Pashur, "Well, don't stop me from unstopping it," and so on. This kind of very suggestive wordplay goes on between the two throughout the scene. Yes, we have to.
Yeah, which then leads on to rather nicely into Barbara Conway's question. She, of course, said, quite as a number of people have said as well, very enjoyable presentation, Mike. Risque even for a Purim spiel at this time. Would Leone's play have to have passed the local rabbi's approval?
Well, this is the interesting tension, isn't it? Because it's hard to imagine. Well, of course, Purim, anything is allowed, isn't it? So that's good. Hard to say, isn't it, really? Presumably, he was very, even by 1550, when he was only, 24 or so, 25, he was already a well-established name. I think he wouldn't have written it had it not have been approved. I think he would not have even attempted to have written it. It was in that, it was quite a close community, as you can imagine. So I think, I think these people were kind of broader minded than maybe we would imagine. So yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. I think they would have approved. Maybe they might not have been in the audience, and it's quite intriguing to try and work out who his audience would be and where they performed it, because there was no theatre. They certainly wouldn't have been allowed to perform it in the ducal palace. So presumably they were performed in private homes, or a private home, or some kind of hall that they had. We have no records, so again, it's impossible to know. But conjecture is always the friend of the historian.
Just to follow up on my request from David Port, his was not a question, he said, but just to say a very interesting and enjoyable talk. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Robert Collins asked, would the general Jewish community be sufficiently conversant in Hebrew to follow the play to that level, the subtleties of it?
Well, I think there must have been, because actually there are many subtleties which I didn't have time to talk about. There are so many, for instance, biblical references or references to Talmud, Jewish law, and so on. And there are lots of plays on words, Hebrew puns, and so on. And this wouldn't have been a play to be read; it would have been a play to be performed. So the assumption must be that certainly the Jews of Mantua were very conversant in Hebrew. And my suspicion is, again, I'm not a historian of Italian Jewish history, but my suspicion is that this was their lingua franca. They would have spoken Italian, of course. They certainly weren't speaking Yiddish, because they weren't from that period, and they weren't Sephardim either, so they probably wouldn't have been speaking Ladino. So a kind of Italian Hebrew of a kind would have been maybe their lingua franca. So they certainly, and he doesn't say in the prologue, which is much longer than I showed you, he doesn't say it's a shame that nobody will be able to understand it. It's saying, let's celebrate our lovely language, which puts all the other languages to shame. And by the way, just I forgot to tell you this bit, but in his 4 dialogues, which is on how to direct a play, which is remarkable, by the way, a remarkable piece of writing and insight, in which he talks about the fourth wall, he talks about method acting, this is like 500 years before Stanislavski, and he refutes the idea, this is really funny, that the Greeks invented drama. Oh no, he says, the Greeks did not invent drama, the Israelites did, because he says, after all, what is the book of Job other than a play? So the Greeks stole the idea, he says, from the Hebrews, and then made it their own, whereas in fact it was the Jews and the Israelites who were the true genesis of the theatrical form. And this is all in the 4 dialogues. So he was a real champion, I think, he was a real champion for the Jewish world. And I can't believe that he would have written a play that no one would have understood. So yes, I think the short answer is everyone was fluent in Hebrew. It's a living language.
A couple more questions. I know it's nearly 9 o'clock, but you'll see why I'm just going to. There's what I want to throw in. Just though it had nearly missed Franklin Davis' question was, why not written in Italian if they were in effect paying the Jews as in taxes to the Dukes?
Well, all the plays to the Dukes were in Italian. So the Three Sisters is Italian play. All the plays except this one were in Italian. This was the only one that we have. Play. He wrote poems and sketches in Hebrew, but this is the only full-length play. So this was clearly a play written for his own community, a play that he didn't want the Gentiles to see or to understand or to have anything to do with. Having said that, apart from Rabbi Amitai being the hero of the day, he solves the problem that there's a kind of huge twist at the end that Amitai comes up with from his wisdom and learning. But we're also told that the Duke is very wise, and that it was the Duke who lets Yedidia off from the charge of rape, for instance, the judge, because he's such a wise counselor. So having said that it really is a play for the Jews, he also doesn't want to take any risks by writing anything that might be derogatory to the ruling family. Very sensible.
And we have a question from your fellow playwright, Milim playwright Anthony Clavane, who I'm delighted has been watching. We say hello to Anthony.
Well,
And he
Anthony.
asks, would Shakespeare have had any knowledge of the play's existence and any influence on the Merchant of Venice?
Ah. Well, who knows? Is a short answer. It's an intriguing. There's a little play in itself, isn't it? That he comes across the play and then decides that this Jewish theme. I mean, Venice is not that far from Mantua, after all. And he certainly mentions Mantua several times in his plays. The likelihood is no, because as far as we know, it wasn't printed as a play until 1610, 1620, something like that. Quite a few decades. Well, 70 years after it's first performed. So it's unlikely that it would have got out in that way. And it was certainly, we don't think that it was translated into English until the 1980s. So the book the play I was working on by Alfred Golding was 1986, and that was the first English translation. So unless Shakespeare was a Hebrew scholar himself and somehow got hold of this copy, it's unlikely that he would have known about it. He might have heard about it because Leone's name as a theatre maker and director was certainly known throughout Europe. His treatise, his 4 dialogues, treatise on the art of theatre making was certainly well known. And in fact, the copy that we know about, I think, was in a library in Germany, for instance. So it was well known and well read. It had been printed properly. And so it may well be that he knew about him and was wondering what other plays he'd written. But it's all conjecture, I'm afraid.
Yes, well, it clearly there's an opportunity for Milim to see if it can support a project along either the lines of a play about Shakespeare and Leone together, or just having this play performed, which Susan Corn asks, do you foresee this play ever being performed today?
I'd love it. I'd absolutely love it, because it works as a play. We did a public reading, and we said to people, what do you think? They said, oh, it's really good. We liked it. It was really funny. And it moves along really well. So it'd be really lovely to do that, wouldn't it? I mean, why aren't I don't know whether there are any Jewish theatre troupes in the country, but the professional stage, that would be really great. So I do foresee it, yes. And I hear Leone's voice shouting at me, get it produced, get it produced.
Well, there's the gauntlet has been thrown down yet again to Milim. So I thank Mike on behalf of everybody watching for a fascinating talk. And quite, it was really quite detailed and absolutely fascinating about the history of these plays. And as you said, something we all want to explore. So what I will just now, this is good. Yes, people are people are putting similar comments in the chat. So just coming up next week, we are continuing our talks. Next week we have Jonathan will be back from his leave, and he'll be hosting. I'm just trying to work out which way this. As I said, doing it one by one person is I didn't do that right. Sorry. Is that it? There we go. No, it's the other way around. I don't know what's happened here. I've got myself in a muddle. Let me put myself back. So next week we have Jeremy Silver talking about towards the digital age. He'll be in conversation with Jonathan Straight about his new book, which will be, I think, will be absolutely fascinating. That's next week, and then the following week we have Ronnie Fraser, whose talk was actually planned for the spring, but due to a family bereavement, he was unable to join us. And he is going to be talking about, and very topically, his latest book, Challenging the Boycotts, the issues about BDS. This is very topical. And as I think we explained last week, some of these talks that we are actually coming up were planned weeks ago, and we could not have expected them to be so relevant today. Later in the month, we will be announcing an in-person event in Leeds, but we've just got to fine-tune that. But in the meantime, we'd be delighted if you can join us online. And as we say every week, I'll just put that up. All our online talks are free. Our in-person talks we do have to charge for, but we would welcome any donations to enable us to put the events on. That will be much appreciated. So for the moment, I would like, and I suspect it will just be a moment, because I'm sure you'll be back again, Mike, to enlighten us about the many topics you talk about in some time, most probably next year. And I'd like to thank Mike on behalf of everybody watching for a most interesting talk. And as Jonathan will always say, Until next time, stay safe. Good night.